All right. Hello, everybody. This is Walker Meadows, Chief Operating Officer at Open Door Capital, and wanted to give you guys kind of a unique peek behind the curtain today. So we got Ben Suttles and Ferris Musa on the line for the two principals at Disrupt Equity, who everybody in our investor base knows very well at this point. And we're basically in the middle of our weekly acquisitions asset management sync meeting. And we were discussing closing timelines for all the deals that we're working on, the loan assumption approval process. And we had a lot of investor questions on both these fronts. So we were like, let's just pause and take a 10 or 15-minute snippet video just to give everybody a kind of peek behind the curtain and help educate folks on what all is involved in the loan assumption process, because it's kind of unique and a lot of folks haven't done this, and it can vary a lot based on the type of loan that you're assuming, and also provide some updates on the closing timeline for both of the apartment deals that we've been working on. So without further ado, this will be a super short video just to educate and kind of give an update on the timelines and kind of a peek behind the curtains to this meeting. But Ben, maybe if you could just tee us off, I think first it'd be super helpful, and you were just kind of explaining this, the differences. All right, so kind of outline what are the steps in the loan assumption process? Why is it even valuable? And then how can it vary by loan type? Because we're really seeing some stark differences between the two different debt types that we're working on with Hill Woodway and Texas 3.
Big stark differences in terms of timelines, right? So let me start off with the easy stuff, right? Which is like what we traditionally do is we get a property under contract. We already have a lender teed up. We already have a term sheet. We already know what we're getting ourselves into. Typically, a good lender, even if it's Fannie and Freddie Mac, can do these in 45 to 60 days, right? 75 on the outside, timeline, right? Because there's a sequence of events. They're underwriting us, they're underwriting the deal. It's a lot more streamlined. Now, that's the easy way to do it, right? That's just a traditional acquisition. You're putting a new loan on it. Now, the Texas 3-pack, we are assuming a CMBS loan. So they're cross-collateralized, right? The whole entire 3-pack has the same loans. It's the 3.81% interest rate. And so there's various entities involved that essentially own the loan, right? Or own the paper on the loan, right? And they do different things. And they all have to review the deal and the new buyer and the new business plan. And they all have questions, and there's a lot of feedback. And then they ultimately all have to give their own approvals, and it all has to essentially line up in a sequence, right? So let's talk about the first entity. It's called the master servicer, right? And I'm not going to get into the different names here of who was actually doing the master servicing on this deal, but there was a company that's essentially doing the servicing of the loan. So they're doing the day-to-day asset management of it, right? And they're the ones that we're going to be ultimately interacting with on a day-to-day basis. So they have their own checklist of things that they needed from us. And we were Johnny on the spot. We provided a lot of information, but then it kind of sits on somebody's deck, right? But ultimately, once it finally gets to the top of the pile, those people then have a lot of questions, and they need all of this different, feedback or reports or, business plans or whatever it might be. And that takes time, right? So that's just entity number one. Now, entity number one finally approved us. I think all of that happened back in July, right? Then they create their product or their package, and then they send it to the bondholder. The bondholder is essentially the person that owns the bond, right? Remember, this is a CMBS loan. Somebody owns the paper on it, right? And ultimately, they have their own checklist of things that they need to ask and reports that they need. And, ultimately, that takes time too, right? So remember, that's just the second entity, right? And so ultimately, that takes time too. And I think we ended up getting that, late July, early August. Then from there, now remember, we got this under contract. I think it was, in late March, early April. So it took that long for the master servicer and the bondholder to finally review our package, provide feedback, ask questions, and then ultimately give us an approval, right? We're not used to that long of a time frame. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we're looking at a 45 to a 75-day close. At that point, it had already been 2 or 3 months. And we're pushing, we're prodding, we're trying to escalate as best we can, but it's a very much a black box situation where it's hard to push people along. And then the other thing that I want to mention to people too is the master servicer, the bondholder, and then ultimately the credit rating agency, which I'll get to here in a minute, also has questions for the seller, because the seller is their ultimate client, right? And so there's reports and things that they need from them too, and that can ultimately delay the process. So here, fast forward, we're at the end of July, early August. We've gotten two of the three approvals, which we sent out to our investors, back in August. And then ultimately, now we have to get the credit rating agencies to essentially review again the package and sign off on the new borrower that's going to be running this bond, right? So that's S&P and that's Fitch. Those all those guys that you have to go out and actually get them to review the current. Where's the bond at now? Who's the borrower currently? Who's the new borrower going to be, and what's their credit worthiness? And then ultimately get their approval, and they have to go through their own checklist of things too. Well, that's what we've been pushing probably the last, I'd say, 4 to 6 weeks. We finally, so we have to get three. We finally got the third, just this week. So once you have all of that, then now we knew this, that there was kind of an intimate and imminent thing that was happening. So we were working our closing checklist parallel to this. So we were trying to save time for our investors because we knew that this was already dragging on. Right. So parallel, once we already had the bondholder approval, we started moving towards closing. Right. So now that we have that third credit rating agency's sign off and approval, now we can set a closing date. So that's going to be next week. So the week of the 18th for the people that are watching this video. So finally getting through this, but three different entities. And really that third entity is really made up of three other entities too. So there's these various people that have to review the package. They ask questions. There's additional information that they're going to request. All of that takes time. You have to push and prod and cajole them along the way because it's not the only thing that they're doing. And ultimately, that is what delays the process.
And
So it's been frustrating, but we're finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
no, and to add, right? So it really boils down to multiple entities that are not going in parallel, needing to wait for the previous one to finish. And on top of that, even within the same entity, it's really two different groups. Usually you have their counsel, their legal, which is usually a different company in itself. And then you have the
Yes.
entity itself. So you really have that as well. And so it's a long, arduous process, tons of paperwork. But again, we're doing it because why? Right? Getting much better debt, really low fixed rate interest rate to kind
Incredible
of
that.
help make these deals a bit more attractive kind of cash flow position. And so that's really what it takes, right? And that's a CMBS. And on the flip side of it, right, there's the other assumption that we're doing, which is another deal, Hill at Woodway, right? And on that deal, it's a lot of the same things. The difference being, right, is that instead of having as many different groups, you have fewer groups, right? And what lenders are looking for, right? Ultimately, like, why is a clean loan like Ben was talking about at the very beginning, which is, hey, this is a brand new loan. Here are the people that are doing it, approved and move on, right? Why does that take long? Why is that quicker than an assumption? Well, it boils down to the fact that now you have double the parties involved. The lender wants to make sure that they and their debt is moving up in the world, right? The person taking on the debt is not someone that is less credit worthy, so to speak, than the person that had the debt. And so that adds complexity, that adds time, let alone obviously getting the different parties involved. And so that's what the assumptions look like. And so thankfully, again, for Hill at Woodway as well, right? That's moving forward. And so Ben, you want to kind of give a quick recap on where that
Yeah.
stands as well?
Yeah, so I mean, we're buying the deal through CBRE, and they ultimately are the lender on the property too at Hill at Woodway, and Freddie Mac is the one that's backing them, and we've done transactions with CBRE and Freddie Mac, right? So that kind of helps streamline the process, but ultimately there is still it's not as quick as we'd like it to be, even on an acquisition, but it's a lot faster than the CMBS loan process, right? Because as Ferris mentioned, there's less entities involved. We have transacted with these entities, so they know us. And so that's allowing us to kind of speed up the process. But, from a timeline standpoint, we've already kind of gotten CBRE's blessing. They're working with Freddie Mac. There's some nuances and some reports and some questions that they had back about our business plan and how we're going to improve the property, which we went over in the investor deck. And because they're a lender, they're going to ask that, right? Again, we are assuming a loan that they've already baked for somebody else. So they want to make sure that whoever's taking it over is not only credit worthy, but it's going to improve the property, right? Going to make their investment and them being CBRE and Freddie Mac better, right? So they've got a lot of questions about that stuff. And ultimately, we should have the approval as early as next week as well. And then it's essentially a 2 to 4 week process to close. So, still a little bit elongated from, a traditional acquisition, but a lot shorter than the CMBS loan process because again, you're only dealing with the original lender who happens to be the servicer in this case too. And then ultimately Freddie Mac has to sign off on it as well. But again, it goes back to, why are we going through all this process? This is so painful. You're thinking this as an investor, right? Again, it's because the debt on these things is so incredible. The opportunity there is worth the additional, delay and closing, because you're just not going to get that type of debt anywhere in the market right now. And I think therein lies the opportunity.
Yeah, and it's known industry wide that like assumptions are arduous like this. Like it's not, and that's
Yes.
why in the contract, I mean, the contract closing dates are a function of the assumption approval process. It's not like, hey, you got seven, because it can drag anywhere. A lot of it's out of our control to a certain extent,
Yeah.
and we can push as much as we can. But that, I mean, this is great news for everybody. We've gotten this question a ton,
Mhm.
and rightfully so. Well, I think one would be good for folks to have a little more insight into what the
Yeah.
assumption process looks like and why we're seeing such different timelines for the two deals we're looking at. But the great news is like Texas 3-pack will be closing very soon,
Mhm.
likely within the next
Yep.
week. And then Hill at Woodway, loan assumption approval is probably coming within the next week, with closing, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks after that. So
Yep.
it's really,
Yep.
really great news. Cool. Well, I hope everybody enjoys this 10 to 15-minute peek behind the curtain. Wanted to give you guys a little more insight into kind of what's going on, a little bit more granular detail than we typically provide. But yeah, if you have any questions, reach out to our investor relations team. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Walker. All right.